and welcome to the darkest hour. I'm your host, amandadarkesthour. Sorry about my voice. I sort of lost it, but don't worry. I recorded my stories before. I also sing for my band, conducted by Forget Me Not. Check us out. And, well, let's just say I lost my voice. But enough about me. Can you recall a time that you were being followed? Was it someone you knew? A stranger? Were you in danger? Or were you just being paranoid? Either way, you likely remember that initial feeling. It's almost like your whole body is trying to tell you something. It's hard to shake. And when you make the impossible choice to turn and look, because you have to know what's watching you, what do you expect to see? I can think of a few things, actually, but none of them come close to the things we'll hear about on tonight's episode. So, let's get started, shall we? I remember it was unusual for there to be fog at that time of year out along the beaches of LA. I will not divulge where and when precisely, as to avoid as much condescension as possible for sounding like a madman. It was a bonfire night, where all the folks in the neighborhood and all others considered to be cool enough were invited out to the beach. And so all of us went, friends and strangers alike, out to the beach, out to smoke weed and cigarettes, and drink some beers, and witness the younger crazy kids spin fire and poi, and all that other stuff that they're into. The reason that I was there at all was that I had a friend named Ben who absolutely insisted I come along to this cool bonfire party out along the beach. Ben's always been a great guy. I've known him for 25 years. He was on Broadway, cast predominantly as a singer. I was proud, and also I was the best man at his wedding. All's to say, I know this man, but things can change. There was this girl, and she seemed really cool. Long blonde hair, curves, magnetic blue eyes. A dream come true, for me that is. I sat out there away from the bonfire, upon a log, contemplating other things, but also contemplating this girl. This beautiful girl who comes up to me and introduces herself. Me of all people. And she asks, "What are you doing sitting out here all by your lonesome? Want to rip this J?" I would have been a fool not to partake. So of course, yours truly, your humble narrator. Well, I'll just say that I partook. I got stoned. Like I mentioned prior, I found it strange that it was such an unusually foggy, misty night at this time of year. It was almost as if a cloud decided to drop onto the beach line, which is strange. Next thing I know, Ben approaches me and the cute girl that I was talking to at the moment. He asks me, "Want to take a walk?" That seemed like a strange question to me because I had supposed it was readily apparent I was totally satisfied where I was, being interviewed by this bombshell blonde. She and I inexplicably both said, yes, and onward into the night we went, further into the fog and into the mist, with absolutely no regard to our questions or our instincts. Yet, I do vaguely remember feeling like I was being called to do something from somewhere I knew not. It was such an odd feeling, looking back upon it now. So Ben, this girl, and I, we walked off past the bonfire, past the organic light source, and into the inexplicable fog and mystery. One of the last things I remember from that evening is seeing a big, bright light, enraptured protectively by the mist and fog. And so, of course, I thought to myself, Yeah, man, why not? And so on I walked, trying to walk into the light, obscured by the smoke and fog and mist and cloud and whatnot. I woke up to my alarm clock going off like madness at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a setting I've never set it on. I was late for work. On my thigh, there was a nasty BB-sized bump that rested in a sort of obsessive trance. I could not leave the motherfucker alone. All I wanted to do was pick and scratch at it. The workplace was already amiss from the moment I set foot through the door. The owner of the establishment already says to me, "Rick, I need to speak with you in my office." Walking into the office of the piece of shit that I'd worked with for so long, I was ever so curious what he had to say this time. "Why didn't you come into work yesterday?" "Look, I'm sorry I was a little late. I usually make it by my 2 o'clock shift, and then the interruption happened." He said, "Yeah, you were supposed to be at work at 2 yesterday, and now, here you are, a day late and $1 short." So I left. I left because I was confused. I sort of remembered being with Ben the night prior, so I figured he'd be able to fill in the details. He's always been an awesome friend like that. So yeah, I drove to Huntington Beach to visit him and his wife at his apartment complex. Now, I've always known that Cleo was a shy woman, but I had earned my stripes with her, and I was the best man at her wedding. It was so strange to see her with the chains and the bolts attached to the door when she opened it. "Yeah?" she asked me. "Hey, Cleo, I was hoping to speak with Ben." "He can't speak," is what she replied with. "What?" I asked her. "He doesn't want to speak to me?" "No," she said. "It's not that he doesn't want to speak to you. He just cannot speak." This immediately perturbed me. I mean, like, what the actual fuck? Decidingly, I barged in through the door to check upon my best friend, in which I found him lying upon the floor, struggling to scream. He had the most clog-stopped guttural sound protruding from his throat. "It's in my voice, it's in my throat." He wriggled and writhed on the floor, and Cleo and I witnessed him convulse before he just fell asleep again. This was a man who performed on Broadway and had the voice of an angel. For someone to scream at me in a night terror, daydream, sleepwalk. Yeah, it's extra scary when one says, "It's in my voice, it's in my throat." I figured my best friend had a thing going on, and alone is where I left him. However, when I returned home, that's where I began with the picking and scratching, and the BB-sized bump that I'd been picking at popped out of my leg, and just like a BB-sized bullet would when not being pursued, it rolled underneath the refrigerator. There I sat. I sat in the kitchen with the tension and the silence, and witnessing a foreign alien BB roll out of my thigh and under the refrigerator. Yes, I asked myself, what the shit just popped out of my body? I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, born in 83. One day as a young kid, 5 years old, I was at my friend Josh's house. He lived 2 doors up, which for me was as far as I could go on either side of my house at 5 years old. Luckily, all of my closest friends as a kid lived within that quadrant. Josh and I were in his basement, which was a finished basement. It had heather brown carpet, a nice large fireplace, and a big TV in the main room of the basement. We'd often be down there in the morning just before or after breakfast, as his mom would be watching me in the morning. We grew up around older kids, and I had 2 older brothers myself, so we often heard of freaky ghost stories, even at a young age. But nothing really similar to what we saw that day, what our childhood minds ultimately dubbed the blonde thing. We were playing with action figures and watching TV. I remember us laughing and playing, and we both noticed movement about 10 feet away from us, on the other side of the room. We were the only ones in the basement. His mom was right near the top of the stairs, in the kitchen, with his baby brother, Nathan. We both just looked toward the motion to see a very short, about 3.5 feet tall, humanoid figure going around the corner, down the short hallway, to the back basement bedroom. She was bobbing her head from side to side as she rounded the corner. We saw her for maybe 3 seconds. I say she and her because what we saw of the figure was long, curly, light blonde hair, almost white, and it draped over her shoulders and her back. The hair was so long it almost went to the floor. She was bobbing and bouncing her head from shoulder to shoulder, like a kid would be if she were skipping and playing. We both screamed and ran upstairs as fast as we could. I didn't see a face or clothes. All we really saw was the long hair draped over what was clearly a small human girl-shaped figure. We didn't know how to really describe how or what to call it, but we surely talked about it, and we always referred to it as the blonde thing. Now, that all happened in 1988. In 2018, I hadn't thought about the blonde thing since the last time I mentioned it, probably 15 years ago, and I hadn't thought about it in just as long. Josh sent me a friend request on Facebook, not having heard from each other since the mid-90s in middle school. He messaged me and I opened it. It was the, "Hey, how have you been, dude?" kind of letter. But at the end, he wrote, "Remember the blonde thing?" I felt like the adults in the movie It must have felt when they get a phone call where Mike tells them it's back. The memory just came flooding back. The crazy thing is we saw it one other time, outside, in the backyard of our neighbor Leota's house. No shit, same thing. Literally saw a skipping short figure with that almost white hair down to the ground go into the wood line behind the house. I attempted to do research to see if other people have ever sighted similar creatures or entities. The closest thing I could find is some old Germanic folklore about a long blonde-haired entity that looks like girls trying to steal babies from homes. Curious as to if anybody has seen something similar. I've been seeing something around that I don't really know what it is. I'm going to preface this by saying it isn't exactly humanoid. It just talks like one. I first saw it when I had a girl over, and she wanted to look out my window at the stars around 4 a.m. So I turned off my LEDs and I opened the curtains, and a deer was out in the road. It looked like a normal deer, until it stood up on its hind legs. It had blood on its underbelly, and it stood like that for several minutes, until we looked away and it was gone. I'm not in skinwalker territory. I've done a lot of research on them to try to figure this out. Of course, that's not my only encounter, though. The next one takes place at a park around 9 p.m. with 2 of my friends. We had just called my friend's mom to pick us up, and 30 seconds later, We heard her little sister say, "Jess." But when we looked up, nobody was there. We all heard it, and we stood up to look at her mom's car, but it wasn't there. It had only been seconds since we called. 5 minutes later, her mom showed up, and her little sister was in the car. We hopped in. The little sister wanted to go down the slide. We watched her from the car, and she came back saying, "Mom, Jess, there's a funny deer standing up over there." And sure enough, it's a goddamn deer on its hind legs. I don't know what this is. I'm in Oregon, which from what I've read isn't skinwalker territory. I read a comment on a post in another sub about voice takers, but I can't find anything on them. My most recent encounter was 3 a.m. when I was downstairs with my 2 large dogs, and my Doberman started barking at the window. I looked outside, and the deer was standing on its hind legs again, staring at the window from the road. I went outside in the morning, and one of the neighborhood stray cats was dead by the tree in front of my house. It could be unrelated, but it really freaked me out. Does this ring any bells for anyone? I know it sounds like a skinwalker, but I'm not sure. This happened to my best friend about a year ago. We were both 18 at the time. My friend and I, both female, about 5'3", 115 pounds. So we're easy targets. My friend and I went to the lake one day with a group of friends. We were hanging on the beach, playing cornhole, listening to music. After a few hours, my friend had to leave because she had work. I asked if she wanted me to walk her to her car, and she said no. A few minutes later, she called me, and this is the story that she told me. She got to her car with no issue. Before she left, she was sitting on her phone, and she heard a knock on her driver's side window. Some yokel, middle-aged woman was standing right outside of her car, asking her to roll down her window. My friend was a little bit startled, so she cracked her window slightly and asked the woman, "Can I help you?" The woman then told her that she needed help with her car, that she had jumper cables, but asked my friend, could she walk with her to the car and give her a hand. Of course, my friend told her that she wouldn't be much help as she wasn't strong enough and didn't know much about cars. The woman begged her to help, saying, "My car is just right through those trees," and pointed to an area that was completely empty. There was no car. My friend told her that she needed to go because she was going to be late for work. The woman put her hand on my friend's window and aggressively said, "No, you need to come with me." My friend then threw her car in reverse and gunned it out of the parking lot. As she was driving away, she looked in the direction of where the lady pointed, and a large man was hiding behind one of the trees. We suspected that the woman was trying to lure my friend out so the man could grab her. They were most likely a team. I've heard many people say that these people will use women to go up to the girls because they're seen as less sketchy. We have gone to the lake several times after, and we've never experienced anything like that again. Anyways, stay safe out there. I was a disbeliever, but this creepy textbook changed my mind. A bit of background regarding myself. I'm a progressive Muslim living in Malaysia. a country stuck between being progressive and conservative when it comes to religious beliefs, and as a child, I always didn't care. So anyways, I was 10 at this time, and usually in my country's education system, we would receive textbooks that were loaned by the schools. These textbooks are often held by previous students of the same school, and when they're done with the textbook, another student would receive it. I received mine from a student who, by that time, had passed away. I didn't think much of it, and I used the textbook as usual. And by usual, that meant that as a 10-year-old kid, I would doodle on it, draw mustaches on random portraits of people. I did this in a religious education book. I drew satanic horns on a famous Islamic figure's portrait. What happened next scared and scarred me for life. It was just me alone in the classroom, after school hours, as I drew those horns and fangs on him. A gust of wind blew over, and the pages of the book were turned. I went back to the page where I was doodling, and I was shocked to see the page ripped out. It was missing. I closed the book and reopened it. To my surprise, it was there, and it was intact. It looked like it hadn't been touched, like brand new. Creeped out, I closed the book and reopened it again. And this time, as I turned the same page again, the portrait of that person was altered, to the point it looked like someone drew a demonic entity over it. It had the typical look of a demon. That's what I can say. I grabbed the book and I threw it into my locker. I locked my locker, and I never went back to my locker again. I went to an Islamic education teacher, and I told him that I would never do that again. The teacher did some work. I guess he did an exorcism. And that's the end of it. Lessons I learned: not to vandalize random stuff. You could be fined and sent to detention, or worse, ending up with the biggest scare of your life. Here's the relevant context to this. 5 years ago, I lived with my late mom in the basement of my step-grandpa's house. My mom wasn't doing so well at the time, and she was addicted to alcohol and some type of pill. I was addicted to my laptop. I had to share the same bed and the same room as her. She also believed in the paranormal, and we would binge shows together like Ghost Adventures, Mountain Monsters, etc. I don't really know when I first began seeing the weird shadow figures. I say figures because sometimes they wouldn't be humanoid. I could just see them from the corner of my eye, but I assume that they're the same shadow creature. I've seen them quite a few times, though it was usually from the corner of my eye, except on 2 occasions. The first one was when I was sitting up in my bed, watching TV with the door closed. I saw something black brush up against the bed, but I didn't think anything of it. I just thought that it was one of my 2 dogs. I later get up and try to pet them, and there's nothing in the room except for me. The second occasion was at night or early morning. I was talking to some friends on Skype while my mom was asleep next to me. She usually left the TV on so it wasn't totally dark. I'm chilling, and then I see a man with a cowboy hat in the corner of my eye next to the TV. I never told my mom about my experiences, but one night she drunkenly spilled that she saw them too. She called them demons of addiction. Addiction demons, or something like that. We smudged the basement a few weeks later, and I felt uncomfortable the whole time, like something would jump out at us. I don't think it was because I was sleep deprived or anything. But I also don't know if it's a shadow man, shadow shape-shifty thing or what. It was pure black though. Like, it was solid. I haven't seen anything like that since, and I haven't seen it since moving to a different state with my other grandparents after my mom passed. I'm not sure if this is possibly connected, but one night, my mom was insisting that there was a demon. I thought she was out of her mind until she told me to look up alabaster on Google. I did, and I went to Google Images. I'm swearing on her grave right now. It was filled with demonic pictures, like the old medieval types of demonic pictures. We never mentioned anything about it again, though, and I never got those results from Googling it again. What do you guys think? I haven't thought about this in years, but another story jogged my memory. When I was a kid, I was absolutely, blindingly terrified of going into my bedroom and the hallway. Like so scared I would literally be paralyzed. If my parents would tell me to change the thermostat, I would do it, because I didn't want to get a spanking, but I'd have to crawl out of the hallway because I'd melt with fear. I used to hear voices and see shadows of people. I'm an only child, so it wasn't siblings or anyone else living in the house. One day, I went to the garage to get a screwdriver. The garage was closed, but there was a shadow of an extraordinarily tall man in the center of the garage. The light was on, but where the person should have been standing, it was dim, and all I could see was a shadow. I screamed and ran inside. After that, I was even more terrified of my house. I never wanted to be left alone. I eventually was shamed by my family, friends, for my fear. I went into my room to cry because they were making fun of me. I was like 9. At that moment, I felt the shadows and voices, but they didn't scare me. They made me feel warm and unafraid. I was never afraid again. My house was haunted as fuck. We moved from this house 2 years ago. At the time, I lived with my parents and my brother. I'm far from a believer in the paranormal, which isn't really the desired opening to a ghost story, but we move on. Despite not being a believer, I've always felt my house had some sort of entity inside. It's been here since the Victorian era, and originally was a shady brothel, owned by an even shadier businessman. My family is in no way related to this shady businessman. To cut to the meat, the history, in 1809, 7 people were found strung up in the basement that no longer exists. A seance was performed in that same basement to communicate with the spirits of the dead. The shady brothel businessman died in the room that I lived in. In 1811, the house was owned by a surgeon who was famously pretty bad. My town has a bar named after him. The house was abandoned until 1847, when the now garden was used to dispose of disease-ridden victims. And on top of all of that, 6 babies had died from various causes, not excluding dog attacks and surgery mishaps. On to the experiences of living there. Most notably, I stepped out of my room into the corridor to see a large flaming cross in front of the mirror. It was there for about half a second. Any visitor who would come to the house would feel really cold at night and feel scratching on their backs. Women with pregnancy-related trauma. They feel incredibly uncomfortable and nauseous walking through the kitchen. Friends of mine who stayed over are no longer friends of mine. Not really, but there's at least 2 who wouldn't enter my room. Often, people would see floating limbs poking from behind doors and entryways. People would have hellish nightmares. And they'd scream. And they'd constantly hear tapping and scratches on the walls. Doors slammed shut. I recall being stared at by an entity from the corner of my bedroom. My brother is woken up with long, deep scratches on his face, his hands. My father refuses to talk about what he saw in one of our lofts. My mother is terrorized by voices whenever she's home alone. Lights flicker when you approach them. Once you pass them, you feel helpless and incredibly cold. Non-sleepwalkers become sleepwalkers. Posters and signs ripped off of the walls. I've had my hand grabbed with immense pressure when I reached up into a cupboard for a drink. Women yelling, footsteps coming up the stairs, dishes having faces on them. Clothes get ruined, hats get stolen, never returned. People occasionally would get flung around, food spoiling in minutes sometimes. So yeah, my house was haunted as fuck. This story took place about 6 years ago. We just moved into a home a few doors down from my mother-in-law's place. She'd been diagnosed with cancer, so we moved closer to help her. My husband and I had 1 child at this time. He was around 2 or 3 when this happened. My son had always shared a room with us until we moved there. His room was on the far side of the house. We had a baby monitor in his room, just in case. About 2 weeks after we moved in, my husband left for work about 8 or 9 p.m., as he worked thirds then. Our son was asleep, and I stayed up watching TV for a little while. All seemed well as I lay in bed listening to the TV, hoping for some sleep. As I start to drift, I hear quick footsteps, like our son was running to our bedroom door. I sat up, expecting my son to open the door. I wait and wait, and the door never opens. I went and opened the door, expecting him to be standing there, but he wasn't. So I walk down the hallway, and I don't see him anywhere. I go to the kitchen to get a drink of water before I try to go to sleep again, thinking this was a sleepyhead playing tricks on me, as the house was so silent. I knew my son wasn't awake. I take a drink of water and something catches my eye. In the darkness in the opposite hallway across from me, I see a little silhouette. I feel a rush and my legs get weak. I call my son's name and I ask if he's okay. He stands there, perfectly still and silent. As I round the counter to go to him, he says, "Mommy, the little girl won't stop playing and keeps waking me up." My heart skips a beat, and I grab him up and I take him to my room. Needless to say, he slept with Mommy for a few nights after that. This one is an old one. It happened early on in my career, and it's one of those events that makes you change how you deal with travel or deal with new people. I was going to travel to San Diego for Comic-Con. We had a client that had us build some things for them. I had never been to San Diego or to Comic-Con, though it was a bucket list event. I was also going alone, and I hadn't traveled for work up to that point. The flight was delayed because of rain, and I had to wait. While I waited, the travel agent called me to tell me that there was a problem with the hotel that I'd been staying at in San Diego. They said that they needed to book me into a different hotel, which was going to be hard given that it was Comic-Con week. They said that they would have it sorted out by the time I landed, and that they would text me the info, so I had it. I finally boarded the flight and we took off. Man, that flight was terrible. The bad weather made for a crazy ride, and I'm not a great flyer when the weather stinks. Needless to say, it didn't start off great from the jump. We landed, and when I turned my phone on, there was a text from the agent, which gave me the name and confirmation code for the new hotel that I'd be staying at. Hotel del Coronado. Anyone that knows the Coronado knows that it's a big deal. For the ghost hunters, this place is awesome, but as a hotel, this place is beautiful and right on the ocean, so yay to me. Downfall meant that more travel in taxis because it was a ways away from the convention center. So I took a taxi to the hotel, and when I got there, it was pretty busy. Lots of people were trying to check in, so I got my stuff and got in line. As I was standing there, an old man that was in front of me turned and smiled at me, saying it was always busy at this time of the year. I agreed to say that I can imagine. He took this as a cue to strike up a conversation and asks me what brought me here. I told him that I got moved to this hotel after mine had an issue, and that I was here for a convention. He smiled, and I asked him what he was here for. He said that he's been coming here for years with his wife. I looked around for his wife just as the line cleared and he moved forward. He was next, and that seemed to end the conversation, and he started to check in. I kept waiting for his wife to walk up, but he finished, turned to me, and wished me a good stay. I smiled and said the same to him. I checked in and I went to my room, which turned out to be down the hall from the old man I met in the lobby. The next day, I went to the show, and it was pretty late when I got back. I went down to the bar and saw the old man. I sat down at the bar and asked if I could order food. They said I could, but I needed to sit over at the tables. It became pretty normal to see the old man from that point on, somewhere in the hotel. 2 days later, I came back from the show early enough to go to the outdoor seating area, and I got a nice view of the ocean. As I was getting seated, I noticed the old man across from me, and still no wife. I was beginning to think that she didn't exist. I sat there looking at the menu, but I kept glancing at the old man, and I started to think about the idea of ending up like him. But then I thought, it looks like he was looking for someone. And I thought, well, maybe she was around here somewhere. After a moment, he looked my way and smiled. He then got up and came over asking if he could sit with me a moment. Not wanting to be rude, I said sure. As he sat down, I asked where the wife was, and he said, I'm sure she's around. He introduced himself as James and asked if I was eating alone. I said yes, and he asked if he could remain sitting with me. We sat and we talked about life and what I did. He said that they had been coming here for a long time, that this was their honeymoon, and all I kept thinking was, where was his wife? I couldn't bring myself to ask him again, but it nagged at me. Then, after about an hour, he glanced over toward the water and said that it was time to go, with a smile. I said okay and thanked him for the company, and he walked back toward the hotel. I finished my meal and went back to my room. The next day, I went to the show and came back in the afternoon. As I got out of the taxi, I noticed an ambulance in front of the hotel. As I walked in, I had to hang in the lobby as they finished up. I asked a bellboy what happened, and he said that he thinks that someone died. I remember getting a cold chill. Finally, I was able to move enough to get to the elevator. As I entered my floor, I noticed that there was some commotion down the hall towards James's room. As I got closer, I noticed a police officer talking to an employee, and then they pointed towards me. I freaked a little as the officer walked my way. He approached me and told me that he wanted to talk to me and that he had some questions. He explained that the old man down the hall had passed away and that the employee said I knew him. I explained that I had met him recently and better at dinner last night. He asked me how he was feeling, and I said everything seemed fine. I asked about his wife, and he looked at me puzzled, and then down at his pad. He said that he was unaware of a wife, and he motioned for an employee. He asked the employee, and they said that he didn't check in with anyone, and he radioed down to the front desk. Someone then came up and said that James had a standalone reservation in that room every year for the last 25 years, and that his wife had died 4 years ago, but not there. I was shocked. He didn't talk about her as if she had passed. The officer thanked me, and I asked if he passed peacefully. He said that he had passed in his sleep, and that it was nothing but peaceful. The officer walked away, and I went back into my room. Later, I went to dinner. I couldn't help but look around for him. I know, weird, right? After dinner, I went to one of the bars by the water. I got a drink and I sat looking out at the water. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a couple walking down the beach. I'm not sure why I looked up because there were a lot of people on the beach and they were pretty far away, but they were close enough to see who they were. I smiled, and I raised my glass towards them, and I went back to watching the water. The next day, I flew home, and after a day or so, it passed from my mind. A few years later, I went back to the Coronado, and that's when I remembered James and his wife. My team and I checked in and later went to dinner. I raised a toast to James and his wife, which I had to explain the story to the team. I haven't had the opportunity to go back in a long time, but I'm sure that they are still there, walking the beach and enjoying the eternal honeymoon. Well, friends, that's all the time we have for tonight's episode. But remember, we've got all new episodes every Friday night. A very big thank you to everyone for sharing your stories. I literally couldn't have done it without you, and I wouldn't enjoy doing any of it without my loyal listeners. So thank you, everyone. So remember, if you love The Darkest Hour, and you never want it to end, be sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me. amandadarkesthour@gmail.com. Also, check out our subreddit and follow The Darkest Hour on Instagram @thedarkesthouryt. Stay spooky.